Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 3 on warfare through time. And we're still in the early medieval period, ladies and gentlemen. Previous video we looked at early medieval nature of warfare. This video we're looking at the early medieval experience of warfare. Now we're looking at 3 particular things: recruitment, how the soldiers were recruited, that's the cavalry and the infantry. I'll talk about that in this video. How they were trained, how the cavalry were trained, how the infantry were trained, and finally the impact of war in early medieval England on the civilians. So it's all about the experience. That's what this video hopefully will show you and prepare you for your exam. Now let's start with recruitment, and let's start with the cavalry. If you remember in the previous video, I talked about something called the feudal system, the idea of the king at the top giving land to his top knights, and in return the knights would promise to fight for the king, if necessary. Now, that was the system, and it was good for getting the top knights. And sometimes the top knights would then be ordered to bring their subtenants, people who they gave land to. They might have to bring 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 lower knights to the king's army. Now the top knights, they were rich people. They had land worth £40 a year. Now you're thinking to yourself, £40 a whole year? That's not very much. But go back 750 years, ladies and gentlemen, and £40 worth of land was a lot. It would be equal to a person's income for 20 years. So the top knights were rich. At the Battle of Falkirk, I'm going to deal with that in the next video. There was a knight there, Sir Giles of Trumpington. What a great name, Sir Giles of Trumpington. And he was fighting for the king through the feudal system. Now, King Edward I, who was the king at the Battle of Falkirk. Now, he was king from 1272 until 1307. In other words, 35 years. And 9 times, ladies and gentlemen, throughout his reign as king, he used the feudal summons, saying to his top knights, sometimes known as bannerets, "You are my top knights. I am summoning you to come and fight for me." 9 times in 35 years. So that was one way that the cavalry were recruited. But, ladies and gentlemen, as the feudal system begins to change and not be quite as strong, it caused a problem for the king. It was tricky getting enough knights to come and fight in his army. I suppose you could say the king was having a bit of a nightmare. Sorry about that. Terrible. So, the king needed other ways of recruiting cavalry. How could he raise cavalry to come and fight for him apart from the old traditional feudal system method? Well, he did begin to introduce new methods, and here we can begin to see our key word, ladies and gentlemen, change. They do begin to change the method of recruitment. I'll come back more to this as we work our way through medieval England. Now, the first one, the assize of arms. Assize of arms. And it was a bit like forcing people, rich people, wealthy people, to pay tax, to give money. The wealthier you were, the more money you could pay. If you had land worth £15, according to the assize of arms, you would have to provide 1 knight, 1 horse, a hauberk, a helmet, a sword and a dagger. You are providing knights and weapons for the king, all organised through this new system, the assize of arms. Method number 2. Remember, I've already said that the feudal system was beginning to fade. It was beginning to change. So something else was needed. And we come. What's that, ladies and gentlemen? Well, you can just see there. It's a shield. But unbelievably, I've covered it in money. US dollars in this case. But why? A shield and money. What's that all about? It's the next way that the king tried to recruit and raise his cavalry, ladies and gentlemen, because it was known as scutage, S-C-U-T-A-G-E. Scutage means shield money. Can you see what's happening? The king would say to his people, right, pay me money. If you do not want to come and fight for me anymore, pay me money. And with that money, the king would then go and hire mercenaries, professional soldiers, men who would come and fight for the king for money. So scutage was a second way that the king is able to recruit the cavalry. And Henry II, 1250, he used scutage. What the king would do is get the money and then go to almost like an agent called a captain. And he would say, right, I need this many knights and I need this many infantry. And then the captain would say, right, well, I can provide you with this many knights for your cavalry and I will charge you 2 shillings a day. But of course, the king has got the money from scutage, the shield money. 2 shillings a day for the cavalry, 1 shilling a day for the infantry. And then the mercenaries would be hired. Often they would travel from other countries, Germany, France. They were well trained, well organised, well disciplined, so they were valuable troops. The king did have to pay, but he got good soldiers in return. This was another way of raising or recruiting an army in the early medieval period. The third way, moving towards a royal household. Now, right at the start of the period, and in the previous video, I said that the king did not have what was called a standing army, a regular permanent army, and he didn't. But the royal household is a small number of permanent troops, paid £5 a year. So again, he's trying to get round the problem of not enough cavalry by holding a regular supply of permanent troops, the royal household. Method number 3. And the final new method, something called indenture. Now basically what that was a contract between the king and an individual knight. I'll deal with that and I'll explain it more in the later medieval video. So there we see the different ways that the king tried to recruit the cavalry. Let's turn to the other soldiers, the infantry. Now then, the feudal system didn't really work here because most of the infantry were the lower class, the labourers. So they didn't own any land. So they're not sort of saying, oh, I'll come and fight for you, king, because you gave me the land. No, they don't own the land. So why did the infantry fight? How were the infantry recruited? As ever, ladies and gentlemen, there's a mixture of reasons here. Let's have a look. Number 1, some people joined out of a sense of duty, a loyalty to their area, their local area, their region, the country, a loyalty to their king. So some joined for those reasons. Others like the idea of adventure. It was an exciting time. Let's go off and fight. Others saw it as a way of escaping from poverty. They were not paid very well as a labourer, and they could probably double their pay as a member of the king's army. So some did it for financial reasons. Money's always important. Again, linked to money is the idea that there was a chance of reward, or to use the word at the time, plunder. If you're a member of the army that wins, you might be able to get rewarded by taking things, either from the army you've defeated or from the nation that you have defeated. So there were a variety of reasons why the infantry might decide to fight for the king. Now then, the local officials, local sheriffs, it was their job to raise the infantry for the king. Now, imagine if you're in an area, you're the sheriff, you're the local official, it's your job, and you come to the area, people are working there, the labourers. Some, as I've suggested, wanted to go and fight, but others didn't. So what they tried to do is they would try to bribe the official. They would try to sort of pay the official to avoid being called up into the army. Now, sometimes it was the best men who didn't want to go, which meant that the king was only getting low-quality infantry. Well, that's not very good. So again, other methods were needed. What could the king come up with to attract and recruit other types of infantry? Well, again, we come to the assize of arms. I mentioned it with the cavalry. Here, all English men aged 16 to 60, they would gather or muster, as they said, once a year, ready to offer the king 40 days military service per year. That was now being introduced. And Henry III got infantry this way for his Barons' War, 1264 to 1267. And again, the commissioners of array, officials, would organise, assess the quality of the men, the potential recruits for the army, and also assess the quality of the weapons that they had. The king is trying to organise in local areas. He's putting officials in to check the quality and quantity of the infantry. Now, that's recruitment. That's how they got the cavalry. That's how they got the infantry. The next part of the experience of war was training. Training. Let's have a look at cavalry. What official training did the cavalry get? You've got to remember where they came from in the social structure. They are rich men. So when they were growing up as young boys, becoming teenagers and young adults, the young rich nobles learned their skills. They learned all about riding the horse and using the weapons. They would practice their skills in something called jousting, where the knights would charge and try and knock each other off. Tournaments. So they practiced. They practiced their individual skills with weapons, like the sword, the lance, the spear. They practiced a lot. So therefore, most of the cavalry, most of the knights, including the very top knights, the bannerets, remember, and other lower knights, they were well practiced in the art of riding their horse and fighting. They were good individual fighters. The whole of society was set up for them to fight. You may have heard of a word, chivalry, being brave and being honourable. There was a chivalric code. That was the life and the society that these young rich men grew up in. They were trained and ready to fight as individuals. What they weren't so good at, ladies and gentlemen, is fighting as a group. They never really had much training in fighting as a group, which was necessary when they went to battle. Sometimes that backfired and the cavalry could be a little bit indisciplined because they were all used to doing their own thing. So that's the training of the cavalry. Now, what about the training of the infantry? Again, it comes back to this idea of social status. Most of the potential infantry were poorer people. They were labourers. They worked. So they didn't have as much free time to train and practice with their weapons. They certainly probably didn't have a horse to practice on. So for the infantry, it was somewhat slightly different. Again, we go back to this new system being set up, the assize of arms. And they said, you've got to become skilled with weapons. But most of them not really. It did not happen. A law was passed, the Statute of Winchester, 1285, saying you've got to practice. Archery targets were set up in towns. Archery practice was forced. It was supposed to be compulsory on feast days, on holy days, on Sundays. 1363, King Edward III says you've got to practice your archery, longbows. We've got to be good at that if we want to win. So they are trying to train the infantry, but it's a slow process. They were not really that skilled. And many of the infantry in the early battles of the early medieval period, they would turn up with some terrible weapons, basic weapons that they used on the farm, digging. They were not really properly trained professional soldiers. They were nowhere near that. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, on this video, the impact of war on civilians in the medieval period. Well, it was mainly negative. Mainly negative. The people, the civilians, not necessarily in the army, they were often the victims of raids. They were often, because people stole their food, they suffered from low morale. Remember that word plunder I used before? Well, if you happen to be in an area and the invading army has come in and won, they would plunder, they would take stuff, often from you. Towns were besieged. Sometimes castles were besieged. Your life was disrupted. If you're in a town surrounded by a wall, if you try and hold out, if you try and fight back, if the invading army gets in, you are in big trouble. Your town will be sacked or destroyed. If you surrender straight away, the rules of war would say, okay, we won't destroy your town, but we'll take everything. So for the civilians, the impact was often very, very negative. Final point. Provisions, food, an army of 10,000, 15,000, 5,000, doesn't matter the size, they've got to eat. Now the army would live off the land. Civilians were expected to feed and shelter the army. This was often very, very unpopular. Sometimes the king would set up a system. He'd say, right, we'll have depot number 1 here, a base, then a base there, then a base there, on the route that he was taking, marching into battle. And then they would store the food there. Okay? But, again, if the army is in enemy territory, they would pillage, they would steal, so the impact on civilians was negative. If the king was in his own land, therefore he doesn't want to steal, he introduced a system called purveyance, P-U-R-V-E-Y-A-N-C-E, purveyance. And this is the king saying to his own people, look, provide me with the food, provide me with provisions, provide me with shelter, provide me with everything I need. I promise to pay you. Don't worry, you'll get paid. Now you might think that's a good system. But sometimes the king either didn't pay, or if he did pay, he paid a very, very low rate. And the people providing the provisions were left out of pocket. So it was quite unpopular. Purveyance was still unpopular. They've lost money because they've had to give the stuff away, and if the king did pay, he didn't pay enough. Also, by giving all the food away, that often left food shortages for the rest of the civilians. And if the food was short, the price would go up, so people would have to pay more for the food. So can you see? The impact on civilians in medieval England of warfare was often quite negative. And they might not even know what was happening. Often civilians did not really know very much about what was happening in the country. Yes, they might be aware in their area, but what was happening elsewhere, they wouldn't know. So there we have it. Experience of war in the medieval period. 1250, 1300, 1350, those first 100 years of the course. The cavalry were recruited, the infantry were recruited. Cavalry were trained, infantry were trained. I've explained that. Impact of war, not very positive. So, we've looked at the nature of war, we've looked at the experience of war. What we need to do now is look at a particular example. Case study number 1, the Battle of Falkirk. Then we can see the nature, the experience, the impact, all in one particular battle. It's coming in the next video. As ever, I hope it's been useful. I'll speak to you soon. All the best now.